and the pot of gold is a compensation scheme. To get over the river, there's no bridge. You decide to go to the water to swim. That is a compensation scheme. So the scheme itself is fine, but the scheme, the access to the scheme, that's an issue. It's a fundamental issue, and a lot of people here who have made submissions to the compensation scheme. And one of the key essence of that is that the compensation scheme should not be managed within the Home Office. It's the hostile environment still exists, and the culture and the mindset of the Home Office is also applied to how they see the analysis and the review of delivery of the compensation scheme, which is a major issue. The Windrush Justice Fund, I launched the fund about nearly 2 years ago. So it was on the back of conversations with Dawn Hill at the Black Lodge Archives, who contacted me and said, Patrick, during the Windrush Scandal, what can the BCA do? I remember having conversations with Jacqueline at the various meetings, the various high commissioners who were trying to lobby the government regarding the hostile environment and the scandal. And I had conversations with JCWI, saying the chief executive of JCWI, as well along with Arthur Torrington from the Windrush Foundation. And what was quite clear that when the government did apologise and recognise that there was a problem, they launched a task force. But the big issue is around access to justice, and I'm sure Jackie will go into much greater detail because there's no legal aid, there's no financial system. You know, I used to be a manager of the Citizen Advice Bureau many years ago, and there was one time, about 10, 15 years ago, in every single London borough, you'd have at least 4 CABs. So the legal advice world and access to justice world has disappeared virtually. So when it comes to the Windrush generation and the children trying to access justice, it's just not there. So I launched a scheme, the Windrush Justice Scheme, a simple crowdfunding campaign to ask money from the public, can you donate to the Windrush? Because what was quite clear, that the Home Office had no intent, yes, they did have a contract with the Citizen Advice Bureau, but the delivery of the work on the ground, and a number of people here in this audience who are working directly and supporting the victims or survivors of the scandal through advice, counselling, information. And one of the things I raised, I had lots of meetings with a couple of Director Generals of the Home Office, before Martin got appointed, by the way, when it came to his role in advising the government. And I said to him, you need to support and fund community groups on the ground who can help people to complete the forms for citizenship. And obviously that's still an issue when it comes to compensation scheme. Obviously you've got the likes of Jackie and other law firms who are doing pro bono work. But the bottom line is there is no grant aid to support organisations, grassroots organisations, and legal advice agencies to support people for advice and assistance as well. And actually what's happened is a number of charities, philanthropists, have stepped in to fund this part of the work, which should be done by the government. And that's still an ongoing issue for a lot of people as well. That's the first thing as well. Secondly, up and down the country, there are an emerging number of Windrush action groups who are working with local authorities, working with community groups and faith groups, and helping the victims. And we've got all the way from Preston, we've got Glenda. Keep giving a hand away from Glenda. No, seriously, she's come all the way from Preston. Oh, Clive from Nottingham. There are about 10 to 15 organisations outside the M25 after the summit who are working in Yorkshire, East Midlands, West Midlands, in Liverpool, Manchester, in the Southwest, who are trying to connect. And what was interesting, because about 20, 30 years ago, we had community relations councils. Can you remember those? Mm-hmm. And they were doing the work around tackling discrimination, housing and employment and accountability around the police. That infrastructure has virtually disappeared. And these organisations on the ground are doing that kind of work that was done maybe 20, 30 years ago. So that's another practical thing that's happened. So with the Windrush Justice Fund, the closing date, by the way, for groups who want to apply is the end of January. And it's small grants up to £5,000 for organisations. And we've got Karen from Movement for Justice as well, who's been the beneficiary of that, along with Clive from Nottingham organisation, as well as BCA. And we are these grants are to organise not just simply conference talks, but rolling out advice sessions and information sharing for the victims and survivors of the scandal. And it's really an indictment on this government that I have to launch raised about £40,000. By the way, the support from Steve Khan, he put £20,000 in, the Mayor of London. But it's an indictment on this government that they have not, despite I've written to them quite a few times, I've had meetings with them quite a few times, and other people have raised issues, that they haven't smelt the coffee. If they were serious about access to the Windrush compensation scheme, irrespective of all the points that Martin raised, they're not serious. How much money was spent on the EU settlement scheme around promotion and marketing and information given? A lot. The only money the Home Office has given is piddling amounts of money for events like these, basically. So something fundamentally needs to change in how serious the Home Office is if they really want to genuinely help the victims of the Windrush generation as well. The other issue connected just on a practical level, connected with that, I've had lots of dialogue with trade unions. So particularly Unison, they've had lots of meetings and they've worked with quite a few of the survivors of the scandal as well. And the TUC are looking at the idea of organising some event in the near future to bring trade unions together, what more they can do around the whole compensation scheme in particular. Also, I want to talk about local authorities. So during the height of the scandal, post the general election in May 2018, a number of local authorities started to have debate at full council about the whole scandal, the impact of hostile environment. I have to say that Hackney Council, I was a former councillor in Hackney, I still live in Hackney for people in East London, we've got Carol Williams here as a cabinet member for the first cabinet member in Britain to be appointed to lead on Windrush. They were the first local authority to have a full Windrush motion and what the council could do in reviewing its services, its activities, and to work with the Windrush families and the generation as well. Lambeth Council have done so, and there are about 15 local authorities around the country who have full Windrush motions. But what needs to happen now with those local authorities is for them to share best practice, how they're supported, because people are still going through the caps, particularly around issues around housing as well, issues around benefits, and requires more joint thinking as well. So that's some of the practical things. But in terms of reflecting on where we go next, I wrote an article in Class magazine, it's online. I wrote an article a few months ago. And I just want to share, because I've been involved with this whole Windrush stuff for a number of years. I worked with a number of people around campaigning for a National Windrush Day, which the government agreed to because of the scandal. I've been involved in working with organisations like the Windrush Foundation and other organisations trying to capture the history and the oral histories of the Windrush generation. And obviously I've been heavily involved in campaigning against the government around the Windrush Scandal through the various, I've done about 5 petitions against the government in the last 2 years connected with around recognising the Windrush generation, the compensation scheme, and mental health and Windrush as well. But I just want to reflect to you what we need to do looking ahead, but particularly what Helen said just a while ago, now we have a new parliament. So I just want to share some extracts of my article. The hostile environment needs to be scrapped, as this is clearly still inherently racist in nature and still breaches the public sector quality duty, which has origins in the Race Relations Act, Amendment Act 2000, which obviously came out of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Also, we have to reflect on the visa restriction that still applies to African Caribbean countries, which still has been in existence for the last 15 years. It should not be applied to the Windrush generation and descendants irrespective of criminal conviction. And another word of because they want to extend the definition of Windrush. The way that Windrush is defined currently by the Home Office for citizenship purposes and for accessing the compensation, they have a cut-off date, which means that the grandchildren of the Windrush generation and the great-grandchildren of the Windrush generation are not seen as Windrush, which means that they can be deported. So you can come here as a 1-year-old, and you may get caught with a minor misdemeanor or whatever it is, and technically speaking, you're a foreign national and you get deported. And if you remember that infamous flight, February 2019, 29 men were deported back to Jamaica. I met some of them when I was in Jamaica last year, and the stories that they could tell you about their experience, it's very harrowing. And that's why we need to bring those men back to their family, back to their loved ones. I think that's still important. I believe the compensation scheme needs to be managed in a different department. I've worked as a civil servant previously, and what's quite clear, that despite all the hard work that Martin's done around trying to work with Home Office officials and civil servants, because they don't really understand anyway, to be quite honest, that the principles of restorative justice should have been built into the justice scheme. And that's quite important, because if you look at the heart of the matter around Windrush and the scandal and its emotional impact on individuals, as well as the financial hardship, it's about restorative justice. It's not simply saying, we'll give you 50p if you've got a receipt for 50p or we're there about, it's about restorative justice. And unfortunately, the scheme does not reflect that, which is a pity. I believe that what should have happened, or what the Home Office should have done, was given automatic payment of £10,000 to anyone being caught up by the scandal, and then work with the caseworkers and what Martin suggested to make sure that people get the right level of compensation. Also, I think, which is quite important, I mean, 500,000 people were told post-71 around the Immigration Act and up to 1981 Immigration Act to get naturalised. Was that legal? Was that proper advice? If not, then people are basically entitled for compensation for making the application of naturalisation with interest in returning it as well. I'm going to double on getting into the end. The other thing I want to explore is around the whole stuff around. I was involved in the whole stuff around Windrush Days, you know, along with others as well. And it's great that the government now recognises Windrush Day. But the Windrush Day itself is not enough on its own. It's not simply having tea parties and jumping up. The whole idea of Windrush Day is to make sure that we embed our contribution to Britain, not just the Windrush generation, but the contribution of migrants as well. And I believe that the Windrush Day Committee, which gives out these grants to the Windrush for Windrush Day, and also the committee that deals with the forthcoming memorial at Waterloo Bridge, should be an independent organisation, almost very similar to Holocaust Memorial Fund, which gets £5 million a year to promote Holocaust Day. Windrush Day should be on the same status and footing in terms of memorialisation.
And walking down the country, not just in London.
Impact over the last 70 years of repatriation. I think we need to look at the wide issue. One of the key things that's had an impact on the black community, particularly as a result of the Windrush Scandal, is that the impact on who are we? Are we really British? Do we really belong here? And what's quite clear, that we need to make sure that we have the resources to embed what we are doing as a community. So I believe there should be a Windrush Endowment Fund of at least £1 billion to support the preservation and legacy of the Windrush generation, its history, its migration, and it should be funding organisations like the Black Culture Archives, core funding that they can deliver the work that we expect to do. And finally, my background is working in health and social care. I've worked in mental health for a number of years, and I've got to know very closely some of the survivors of the scandal who have shared their experiences of the traumatisation of the hostile environment. And you have to bear in mind that this hostile environment was socially engineered. I compare the Home Office to the mafia. The mafia works on two principles: fear and intimidation. The hostile environment was about fear and intimidation. Fear that you might be deported, fear that if you put yourself forward that you might lose your citizenship or not recognise your citizenship in the first place. And this has a traumatic effect on people's mental health well-being. I know that me and Martin have clashed on this recently, but 5 people have died in the UK as a result of the hostile environment. And this government and Collins have not acknowledged that at all, and it's fundamentally flawed. What needs to happen now is those people who've been caught up around the scandal needs to have access to counselling, support, a whole range of things around that, because what you can see, we've had over 30, 40 years of overrepresentation in the psychiatric system, and if people don't get the right support now over the next couple of years, there might be even more overrepresentation in the mental health system. So we need to have a national strategy to support the survivors and their families around mental health and well-being because of the traumatic effect of the scandal. It's no different to what happened to people with Hillsborough, it's no different what happened to Grenfell. This is a community trauma, but the government does not understand that, and that's why the Home Office is very narrow, and it requires a cross-governmental approach, requiring Department of Health and all the government departments together to deal with this issue, because this is a national scandal. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was incredible. So we've heard a lot about the context, we've heard a lot about updates on what's happening. Helen has brought numerous examples of documentation that her firm does on the ground, helping real people access the compensation scheme. So Jacqueline Mckenzie, please.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you everybody for coming on this cold Saturday. The reason why I looked around is because I forgot what I was asked to speak about. I've been speaking about Windrush for 2 years, and I seem to say the same thing every time, and I really don't want to bore anybody. I am going to be dealing with some of the practical issues, but I do want to deal a little bit with some of the background. Martin always says that, you know, the whole debate about Windrush is becoming politicised, and it isn't. And other people are very critical of us when we refer to this issue as being underpinned by racism. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a very political issue, racist issue, or racism very much. If there is a scandal in this country which affects, in the majority, people who look like me, then there must be some racism in there somewhere. And if there is an issue in this country that has come about directly as a result of decisions taken and votes made in Parliament by our legislators, then that is political. And we mustn't be scared to say that. So everybody here will be aware that this scandal emanates, or in the public form, from around the winter of 2017, although we started seeing that major onslaught of articles around the spring of 2018. But as one of the speakers said before, we've been seeing these cases. I think it might have been, I actually can't remember who said it. Somebody said that they recognised the issue when it broke because they'd been dealing with these issues before. And I certainly had. For the whole time I've been practising in law, we've been aware of the Windrush issues, although we didn't define them in that way. And in 2015, I actually gave a speech to the Diplomatic Corps, which is recorded. And in that speech, we discussed what can be done about our elders who've come from the Caribbean, aren't documented, and are being required to spend thousands of pounds to naturalise. And again in 2016, I ran a seminar for the CARICOM, so that's the Caribbean nations, their diplomatic corps, and we raised exactly the same issue there. So this is not a new issue. We're grateful to the media for bringing it to the fore, but have been living and breathing this issue for a very long time. You'll also be aware, independent UNO people, well, you know, that's the system, you've just got to pay all this money and naturalise. And what we should have been doing then was agitating and doing some political work then, maybe to have averted this issue. And you may or may not be aware that that 1971 piece of legislation came about as a result of the speeches made by Enoch 1968, 1969, race riots, and a fear that too many people who had no other status than to be British. So my grandparents and parents, when they got on those rickety boats and sailed across the oceans to this country, in their consciousness they were doing nothing more than the Auntie Nellie of a white family who was moving from Liverpool to London to live. They were just moving from one part of the motherland to another part of the motherland. Somehow legislation came about that said, no, actually steady on there, mate, too many of you are here, and we're going to see to it that this all stops. And then we had the 1981 Act, and I was a student then, volunteering at the Grenada High Commission, and I remember the queues around the block of people coming to get help, to fill out. Didn't know what was going on, mind you, just, you know, put your name there and your date of birth there. And that was because there was a recognition of this problem, and so people were given another opportunity to avail themselves of citizenship. And of course, a lot of people couldn't, for all manner of reasons. And I've seen over the years some of those reasons, because I actually get Caribbean people who tell me that anybody affected by the Windrush Scandal is stupid, or is their own fault. And when Thatcher was giving it away, why didn't they sign up? Or when this one was doing that in that year, why didn't they do the other? And it isn't that straightforward at all. First of all, people shouldn't have had to do anything. They should have been given the status that they thought they had when they arrived, and all those vignettes in passports and stamps in passports that have now turned out to be useless pieces of paraphernalia shouldn't have been the case. Seen all sorts of issues around names. You know, people left the islands with one name, they got here, they were given another name, there were spellings. And you know, even today, the Home Office is one of these sorts of institutions that you just get one thing out of place, and that's the end of you. And so, you know, to be describing people who are victims of racism and political malfeasance as being stupid is really disgraceful. And I do hear it coming from within our own community. But nevertheless, they were stripped of this status, and there's a body of people who couldn't avail themselves of it, even if they had the money to naturalise, and some of them didn't have the money. Because even today, to naturalise, it's £1,330. That's an enormous amount of money. And you've got to do something called the Life in the UK test, which is another £50. And then you can do a course to pass that, because people always feel, you know, there's a marketing of it. It's a business, isn't it? It's a business. The Home Office is a business. And there's a marketing of this course, because you're told, well, you're not going to pass it unless you do this course. So they go, that's £250 to do that course. And most of the people affected by the Windrush Scandal don't need to do the Life in the UK test. Although you do, if you are from countries in West Africa and Asia, and they are involved in the Windrush Scandal too, you have to do an English language test, and that's £200. And if you use a lawyer like me, it might be a few £100. If you use a lawyer like Martin, it could be, it's a shame he's not here, it could be several thousands of pounds. So, you know, you could have spent £4,000 or £5,000 to acquire status that you already thought you had. And technically you were right in thinking that, so people didn't bother with it whatsoever. And so we saw the manifestation of the scandal with people being detained, deported, denied access back into the UK. And the denying of access back into the UK is an interesting one, because it was the airlines that were doing that. And that was because of a piece of legislation in the Carriers Liability Act, which actually started to fine airlines if they allowed somebody to board a plane that couldn't prove they had the right to be landed at the other end. So you had your little bit of paper, or your faded vignette, your passport that you got when you got off the boat in 1948. The airline wasn't taking any chances. You know, the fine was £20,000 per person. And so a lot of the families, particularly with Jamaica, where we've seen a lot of people stuck out in Jamaica for years, in the case of Vernon Van Riel, 13 years. Somebody, I don't know if she's in the audience, but some work has been done with her earlier this morning with one of the film crews, got stuck out from 1976. Come back to her in a minute. And so what happened is that the state extended its role to all manner of organisations, airlines, hospitals, schools, employers. And we know it escalated, because this has been happening for a very, very long time, but it escalated with the hostile environment, legislation from 2012, but caricatured in 2014 by what we now call the hostile environment, and it's arguable whether Labour or the Conservatives are responsible for it. It looks as though they both are. But we got there, and as a result of literally every bit of society, even nursery schools, I have had nursery schools ring me up and ask me about a child's rights to be in that school, even though you've got the Education Act and the Children's Act, which supersede any immigration legislation anyway. And somebody running a nursery doesn't understand that, and they're frightened, you know. So as a result of the hostile environment, we saw the numbers escalating because everybody became scared. We have almost as though we became some sort of weird dictatorship where we turned all sections of society into immigration officers. Little shopkeepers being able to destroy someone's life by saying, well, I don't like the look of that in your passport, you're going home. And so that's why the scandal became well known, because we saw with those very early cases of people like Albert Thompson being denied medical treatment, and you know, people suffering from cancer, and hospitals saying to people who were de facto British citizens, you can't have medical treatment, or you can't come back into the country, or you cannot go to university, which is a big one that we're dealing with. And that's one that's very dear to my heart, given how in the Caribbean, or African and Caribbean community in particular, the importance of going to university and the importance of social mobility, given the historical roots of slavery and colonialism and what this has done to our society. But we had the scandal, and the Home Office set about putting into place some measures to deal with it. They set up the task force, and you know, generally speaking, a lot of people have gone through the task force and have been given some sort of status. Mostly, people have been given indefinite leave to remain, but a lot of people have been recognised as British citizens. And genuinely, that is going relatively well, but there are still some concerns. There are concerns that people who were in the country before the 1st of January 1973 are being denied British citizenship as a consequence of having criminal convictions, and we say, well, British people commit crime. So you give them their citizenship. We're also seeing some inordinate delays. People are having to provide biometric data, and we think that that's wrong. And there has been quite a large burden of proof on individuals, even though, as somebody said earlier, we've got joined up government. And why can't the government go and look for its national insurance records and its NHS records rather than bothering people who haven't kept records from the 40s, 50s and 60s to do this job themselves? It's just to put more stress onto people. The government launched also a lessons learnt review done by an independent advisory group. In fact, I sat on it. It's over a year since we were meant to get this publication. There's all sorts of rumours about it. I've signed some confidentiality clause. So, you know, but generally speaking, it must be, in my opinion, that the government, and they might be less so now that they have this overwhelming majority, were frightened of this coming out. But why should you be frightened of what the Lessons Learned review? If you are genuinely sorry about what you have done to people who have been affected by the Windrush Scandal, get them out and start addressing the issues now. It's been almost 2 years. They've set up a Windrush advisory group. That's new. We don't know where that's going to go. They keep setting up structures. But we don't want structures. What we want is justice. And we want that justice now. It's well overdue. It's 2 years. And I have a feeling, you know, that no other community would have been treated like this, because overwhelmingly, this issue affects black people. Now, the definition of it doesn't, but overwhelmingly, in terms of who the victims are, it does. And it's even more narrow than that. Overwhelmingly, it affects Jamaicans. And we know how this government treats Jamaicans. They're only one of 2 countries in the Caribbean that are required to have visas to come to the UK for a holiday. you're coming here to see your auntie for 2 weeks and you have to have a visa and pay money to do that, even though you were probably born as a British subject. People always ask me if I think this was deliberate. I think there's some bits of it of direct policy, and we know, there was legislation and the hostile environment is a policy, and the bits of it that make up the hostile environment is policy. There's somebody sat in a room and thought we could reduce the net migration figures by getting rid of some little elderly black people. I don't think so. I don't think so. But there are two things that I do think about this scandal, and one is that I think the government was absolutely shocked by the response to it from across sections of society. I thought I was getting a little warning that I need to shut up because I could go on. I'm not going to be much longer. They were absolutely, sorry, I was before then. I think they were shocked at the level of support for the Windrushers because, as you know, migration is an issue that, you know what the headlines usually are about migration, but they were absolutely shocked that white people and middle-class people and people in the shires and the whole counties and even the Daily Mail or the Daily Fail or the Daily Hail, all of those lot were shocked by this issue, and the copy, pages after pages and pages, were, expressing that horror that something like this could have happened. And I think that took the government by surprise. But what did not take the government by surprise, and which is why I think there may well have been a bit of deliberate action here, and certainly deliberate malfeasance in the way the community's been treated 2 years into the scandal, is that they looked at who are the victims, they looked at what does this community have to respond to this, and they saw very little. There are no community leaders, there are no community organisations, major ones I'm talking about. We're not, I'm not saying any other community is homogenous, but there are some communities that are organised around faith organisations, or they're around some sort of religious building, whether it's a synagogue or a mosque. And the Caribbean community in particular is not like that. It's a very fractured community. And when people keep going on about, we've been here 70 odd years and we must celebrate, and I'm one of those who say celebrate what? And I'm very opposed to the street parties and the effects and all of that. We don't know anything about those at all. If we're going to do anything to mark the time we've been here, it's got to be structural. And it's got to uplift our people and change the circumstances.
Amen to that.
Windrush Day, it exists. But I think that, and we make the most of it, but I think that this government was fully aware that this is a community that doesn't have the resistance. Where is the resistance? We've seen with the anti-Semitism, and I'm not making a comment on anti-Semitism at all. I don't know enough about it. I'm sure it exists, and for people who are victims of it, it must be very horrid. But look at how that has taken ascendancy. And that is because of the power that that community has. And I'm not criticizing that community, good for them. But what's wrong with us? When are we going to fix up and organise so we can have that level of resistance, so that things like the Windrush Scandal don't ever happen to us again? So it brings me quickly to what I was supposed to be talking about, and that is, because of this government's malfeasance, we have had to self-organise.
Yeah.
And there are lots of very good organisations around the country. We've mentioned the woman Glenda Andrews come all the way from Preston, and Clive Foster's come all the way from Nottingham, and there's some members of Windrush Action here who mainly work in London. There has been an enormous amount of self-help work going on in the community, all unfunded, people working all hours around the clock to support people who are victims. But there has been no organised help for this coming from the government. In fact, they put out a tender some time ago that community organisations were going to be allowed to bid for funding to do some of this work, and then that was withdrawn. Firstly, It went from 800,000, that 800,000 was for the entire country. It went from 800,000 down to 600,000, and now it appears to be zero. We haven't heard anything more about it, and the deadline to bid to it's gone.
Wow.
I know it was put on hold, but what has happened to it, and why are you only dealing with these issues 2 years in? Now, Martin has updated you on the compensation scheme, and Patrick has spoken about trauma and mental health, and because I know I've gone over my time, I'm not going to deal with those things. But part of the self-help has been to run surgeries for people requiring, initially it was for people requiring help with status documents, and through the work of the Black Cultural Archives, and we're very, very, very grateful to the Black Cultural Archives for facilitating my work and the work of Windrush Action and others who have come along to support people who are victims. We saw over 500 people who were victims, working through the night sometimes to help people fill out what were quite complex status documents. And then they'd get letters back asking for more things, and you know, when did you work and when didn't you work, and that sort of thing. And now we're doing the same thing with compensation. And the need for this is crucial, because Martin will tell you, I mean, the real job here is a legal job. It's a claim. People are making claims. And so whereas I think it's wonderful that there are all these community initiatives helping people to fill these forms out, you're making a claim. And that's a very difficult thing to do. It's very complex. And I'm a lawyer. I'm not a claims lawyer, but I'm a lawyer, and you think there might be some transferable skills, but we've really struggled with it. You know? Some of the stories are such that they don't fit neatly into the parameters of the claim anyway. I know very early in the scandal, Amber Rudd had said that she favoured a scheme. Do you remember? I don't know if you remember that, it was such a long time ago. She was the then Home Secretary who fell on her sword, didn't she, for lying to Parliament. But, you know, she said that she was going to do a one-off payment to people irrespective, you know, of the claim. And maybe that might have made some sense when you look at it now, because it's very difficult. And the other thing, I was at a meeting yesterday at the Jamaica High Commission. It wasn't anything to do with this, but of course Windrush comes up all the time. And he had been told by the Home Secretary, that's the Jamaican High Commissioner, Mr. Seth Ramajan, that he was very concerned at the low numbers of people, and I think Martin alluded to that too. But I'm going to tell you now, the numbers are going to be low. The numbers are going to be low. Windrush is going, the numbers overall for Windrush are going to be much lower than a lot of us thought. Because so many of the people who would have been affected by this went off and spent those thousands of pounds. And naturally, because we're mobile people, you go home. You go home to see your mum or your whatever, and you need a passport. So people found a way of fighting the system to get that documentation. That's one of the reasons why the numbers are low. But the reason why the numbers are low with the compensation is because most people aren't going to qualify, as far as I can see, because it's very difficult to demonstrate loss within those parameters. So about 300 people I've seen, I can't identify a loss other than they might say, well, I was stressed. And that would be it. But people were resilient. Our people are very resilient people. Might not be an organised people, but are very resilient people. They found ways of continuing to work, you know, hiding here and doing this and so on. I even found somebody who'd been deported and managed to snuck back in the country in another name. And then it turned out that she was entitled to be here. So good on her that she was able to do that. Because she, you know, was legitimately meant to be in the country anyway. So we're resilient people. So I don't think the claims are going to be high. But when we see the stories like Glenda Caesars and so on in the newspaper, we raise, you know, we get concerned, even though we don't know the entire story there, and Martin has partly explained that. But and I know some of you, I recognise some of you in the audience who I've met before, I know some of you have got claims being processed. The Black Cultural Archives will be running a new series, or launching, and today is effectively the launch of a new series of surgeries. So do avail yourselves of those. They're going to be very important. Martin always makes himself available, as does others, and there are other lawyers from my firm and other firms who are available also. I have a little newsletter you can take. I've also brought some of the, this is the Home Office. People will say I'm anti the Home Office, but here I am doing their work, you know. No, I'm not that anti. So I brought some of their forms. You know, you can make a claim if you're a primary claimant or if you're a secondary claimant, you know, relative of. And there are some claim forms for estates. So if somebody died, you can claim from their estate. I've got some of those forms here. We've also got some forms that you can fill in, which helps you prepare in advance to come to the surgeries. It tells you what sorts of things to bring, and it gives you, it's a story there to fill out. So Tanya in the front there had done some work with me on developing this. It gives you a little idea as to what sorts of things you're going to be asked for when you come to filling out your major form. So do avail yourselves of those surgeries. The Citizens Advice Bureau is there. I've been very critical of the Citizens Advice Bureau based on, well, I used to manage them in Hackney, actually, as a director of grants in Hackney, and I used to manage them. But also because I know, I thought it was a bit of a cheek, the government choosing the CAB, because so many people went there in the first place for help with their immigration status and were told all manner of nonsense, including people who eventually had to leave on a voluntary basis or who were deported. So I wasn't very happy with that, but that is the system, and we've got to work with what we've got. We will continue arguing with the Home Office about how this is done and that they should fund people properly to do some of this work. And I'm just going to close on one thing. We have the Windrush Scandal. I see in the room people from Movement for Justice who do quite a lot of work on deportations or stopping deportations, and they are also very critical, as Patrick said, in widening Windrush, because what are the definitions of it? Why are there these restrictive parameters? You know, we've got people in the country. We're not asking you to open the doors and have lots more people come in. We're realistic, I'm realistic, and I do accept that countries have a right to monitor their borders, but to do so humanely and to do it justly. And a lot of the decisions we see are neither of those things. We've seen the consequences. There was the charter flight to Jamaica, as Patrick referred to, in February of last year. We now know there's another one in February. And we saw people being ripped out of their homes at 5 o'clock in the morning. We know of a family that even now the daughter was preparing for a GCSEs, and because she witnessed that, she's traumatized. We've got the issue of the fees that people are being asked to pay, particularly children. You've probably seen, if you're active on social media, some of the campaigns around these fees, particularly the fees for children who were born in the country to become naturalized. We've got the issue of family settlements. We've got another horrible issue of people who aren't, who are mostly from the Caribbean, who don't require visas to come to the UK. And so they get on a plane and they, you know, saved up for months to come to see their auntie or their godparent. And when they get to the airport, an immigration officer is going to say to them, well, where exactly are you going and what have you come here for? And they can't quite articulate it, because you know we call our aunties Tanty so-and-so or cousins, but the person has a real name, you know, Esmeralda Mckenzie or something, and that relative doesn't even know that, just coming up to a relative. And so when they get here, because they've said, well, I'm coming up to see my auntie, and this person says, well, actually, there's no such person, they're denied entry. Wow. Or they're denied entry because they have a credit card and they can't prove how much money is on it. And what do you think happens to those people?
Wow.
Because they can't just turn them back the same day. They're not going to land them into the UK. So what do you think happens to them? They put them in immigration detention.
Oh, no.
And I've seen people end up ill as a result. We get the calls when those flights come in at 6, 7 in the morning, and we get the calls from the High Commissions to deal with these issues, and it is growing. I thought it's something that might stop, but we're seeing an increase in the numbers. So the hostile environment is alive and kicking, and we all here have a duty to advocate and make sure we do something about it, because the very fact that there is a system, or that government people use the word hostile environment, the very fact that there is anything predicated in that way tells us that we've got problems. And as I said at the outset, there is racial overtones or undertones. It's political. All of us have a vote. We've just had an election. I won't say anything about that because I'm not here to be party political. But we've got to become active citizens and make sure, because it might not affect me or you, it is affecting our brothers and sisters, and make sure that our voices are heard and that our people and the victims of the Windrush Scandal get some justice, because it's not happening at the moment.
one more speaker. I'm sure you're all as impressed as I am with all of the information that we're receiving today and the updates and the news. So we're going to close with Councillor Sonia Winifred, Cabinet Member for Equalities at Lambeth Council.